Hello guys, Dr. Peroxide there, and today, after months of having this idea somewhere in my head, I will be making a top 5 most difficult bosses in IS. Here are the rules of this ranking. I will consider bosses at maximum power, so if they have items that debuff them, I won't consider them, or if they have a more difficult alternative version, I will absolutely consider them. I will consider bosses with their meta at the time, and only when they got released, meaning, for example, even though Wizardale was released during IS-4 era, it wasn't released for when the fourth boss of IS-4 was released, meaning I won't consider this boss with Wizardale in mind. Finally, I will not consider bosses post IS-5 expansion 1. Why is that? Because I haven't spoiled myself about IS-6, and also because I was training in editing. I still haven't been in the bunny! Also as a bonus, and as suggested by my comments, I'm also gonna give some tips to help you beat these bosses, or at least, those that are available. So anyway, here is the top 5 most difficult bosses in IS. Number 5. Frozen Monstrosity. We're starting this top 5 with a surprise. I'm pretty sure a lot of you didn't expect a boss from IS-1 in this list, but I truly believe Frozen Monstrosity deserves this place for mainly 3 reasons. The first reason is that this boss was actually pretty hard. It boasts a pretty high attack, very harmful mechanics, and was backed by some very powerful enemies at the time. The second reason was the meta at the time. IS-1 was released on February the 25th as the second part of Eunectus' event. And do you know what that means? It means that at the time, we didn't even have Surtur, one of the first true boss killers in the game. Not only that, we also didn't have Lumen to remove the freezing effect, meaning usually the whole strategy revolved around Blaze and her negative status reduction, Thorns and or Eyjafjalla for range damage, then Chamare for debuffing, and Saria for healing and arts damage amplification, while all being backed by Nightingale for aggro drawing, damage reduction, and more healing. A very tight strategy that left basically no room for error in hard mode. But the worst thing about this boss isn't even this. No, the worst thing is that this boss, unlike every other boss in this list, was temporary. Once IS-1 ended, it was gone for good, and its stage only got a rerun way later in IS-3. If you wanted to claim having beaten this boss in hard mode, you had only 14 days to do so. If you somehow managed to do it at the time, well played, you're one of the few people who were able to. Number 4. Big Sadlock. Here's an interesting fact. Even to this day, Big Sadlock remains the non-reclamation algorithm boss with the highest HP in the game, only tied with Quilon, Avatar of the Mashatava, totaling a grim 300,000 HP, which isn't even accounting the hard mode relics, nor his 15% max HP shield that he would cast every 45 seconds. Now, what is the Blank Suicide Letter? It's an item that you can get after getting 2 specific encounters that disables Big Sadlock regeneration. Meaning, if you were unlucky and got the crown, you had to fight a bear with 435,000 HP that would heal for 1087 HP every second. So I know what you're thinking. Compared to Quilon, who can have more than 2 million HP, it sounds pretty low, right? You're right, but keep in mind that the meta at the time was vastly different. Also, Big Sadlock has a very punishing mechanic that makes him inflict his attack stats to the whole map as arts damage for every 20 instances of damage they take, meaning it further shrank team building options. Picking Thorns was a really bad option, and so was Exusai, for example. The best option to kill it was having several powerful instances of damage like Blazes 2, Calcitus 3, or Nil Alter S1, AoE medics to resist the constant stream of damage, and one good self-sufficient lane holder on the left, for example Mudrock, and make sure your DPS was enough, because just like all other static bosses, after a 10 minutes checkmark, if you still didn't kill the boss, it would explode, dealing 30 objective shields of damage, instantly ending most runs. Number 3. The Last Knight. Even to this day, the Last Knight remains one of the most obnoxious bosses in existence to fight, and the reason is his passive. Every time a unit attacks him, they get called for 2 seconds, therefore reducing their attack speed, but even worse, if said unit lands 2 attacks too fast, which will happen in 99% cases, particularly since the call duration gets increased to 4 seconds once the Last Knight's HP falls below 50%, they will get frozen for a couple seconds. This cannot be silenced and passes through any form of invisibility, meaning only a handful of skills could bypass this mechanic. The strategy to deal with the Last Knight was very different from any other IS boss at the time, and actually very similar to a lot of max risk CC. Since the Last Knight is not immune to slow, movement speed reduction, stun, root, or sleep, the best way to deal with him was actually to rotate some powerful CCs like S1 Kafka, S3 Rosa, S2 Eunectus, and so on, while slowly chipping his health away and dealing with other enemies. Blocking him was theoretically possible, but was dangerous, since the Last Knight has a base attack of 2000 at Surging Wave 0 and deals 75% more damage to frozen targets, meaning basically everything that would block him. Then, once his health drops to 0 for the first time, he revives with 25% HP, has reduced movement speed, and stops attacking but is now unblockable, meaning the chip damage strategy becomes difficult. Here, the best thing to do is to try and burst him, but here's the thing, the Last Knight's defense is spectacular. In Surging Wave 0, his defense is a phenomenal 4000, which can be lowered to 800 when randomly acquiring the Knight's Corpus before the fight. But remember, I consider bosses at their maximum power, so I won't include this item, meaning dealing physical damage was extremely hard without this item. What you could do, however, is use skills like Garda Mia S2 or Chen S3, which are the only skills that had immunity frames against his cold, boosted with Warfarin and Shamare. If you did all of this while also having good collectibles, then maybe you had a chance against him. Number 2. Izzumik, Source of Ecology. I didn't want to include Izzumik in this list, not because he doesn't deserve it of course, but because I will have to explain his entire mechanics, as well as the mechanics of the map, which, in total, is this long. But to sum it up, Izzumik has 2 phases, one during which Izzumik is invincible and will spawn several insanely tanky jellyfish that will transform into random enemies once blocked. Then, after Izzumik either quote-unquote absorbs 20 jellyfish by getting in contact with them, or by surviving 6 minutes, Izzumik changes form and will now unleash shockwaves that deal 96% of its attack and stun units for 8 seconds. It wouldn't be much of an issue if, while during the first form, for every 5 jellyfish absorbed, Izzumik didn't gain 40% increased attack for a grand total of 160% if he manages to absorb all 20. It's basically impossible to survive Izzumik if he absorbs all the jellyfish, so you have to kill them. The enemies that transform from the jellyfish aren't usually very tanky, but if only one slips through, it can be a disaster. You might be thinking, just use units with a high amount of block. Well, that's precisely where the collectible hesitation comes into play. It is the weakest mandatory collectible you can get when going for this ending. In fact, it's a debuff. It reduces the block of your operators by 1. Although the block count can go down to 0, it's still much less practical than having any of the other 2 collectibles that both increase your block count instead. So when adding this collectible, the absurd amount of enemy spawn, their insane stats, the various mandatory debuffs you get by reaching this ending, and the fact that even if you manage to survive 6 minutes, you still have to kill Izzumik quick because it will stun your operators every 30 seconds, then you must face one of the strongest bosses ever created. Funnily enough, Lee can bypass a lot of his mechanics, Weedy under very specific conditions can one-shot him, and Passenger with his hand and the collectible that gives him camouflage can allow him to solo the stage, which is where the name Godsender came from. Still, Lee wasn't released at the time, and the other 2 strategies are so specific, you shouldn't really try to resort to these. Before going to number 1, let me give you 3 honorable mentions, and actually all 3 of them will be from IS-4. The easiest of the 3 is the alternative version of Sami Willin, the Resolution of the Very North, called Ice Cold Image. This stage features dangerous hazards, passive cold applied to all your operators every now and then, many freezing spiders and drones, extremely tanky silver wand bulwarks, many powerful saxophonists that can also one-shot a lot of ranged operators, a very short path for enemies to go through, for a grand total of 107 enemies. It's still doable if you focus on being able to defend the top left corner while killing the saxophonist and making sure your operators don't get frozen by preemptively killing the drones and slugs. It requires to be extremely fast, but it's certainly doable. The next 2 in this honorable mentions list are actually almost the same. Karendu Kagen, the Scourge of the Land, and Lugal Sargus, the Overlord of Ages, from both Sands of Time and Enter Eternity. Sands of Time is probably the easiest of the 2, featuring actually some basic enemies, while Enter Eternity features more dangerous ranged enemies that can destroy your strategies if left unchecked. In both stages, the strategy is pretty much the same, protecting the blue box at the bottom while dealing arts damage to Karandu and dealing physical damage to Lugal Sargus, and try to kill them more or less at the same time. These are both hard stages because the bosses will eventually reach the blue box since it's basically impossible to block them, but it can still be cleared. Ray and Surtur were extremely good options, Surtur being able to tank Karandu's attacks for a couple seconds, while Ray could snipe Lugal Sargus from afar, rooting and dealing damage to him, and if all of this wasn't enough, you could simply focus your resources on one of them and leave the other one. This is also why I didn't want to put most IS-4 bosses in this list. It was actually pretty easy to gather 31 HP in this mode and leak the boss. Leaking one of the 2 bosses was even a condition to unlock one of the chapters in the IS-4 book. This certainly worked for most bosses. And finally, number 1. The boss that deserves the title of strongest IS boss ever created. A boss that has traumatized an entire generation of IS players when it came out. This boss is none other than Ishamla. Just kidding. Of course, number 1 is Cresson and Sentinel. I made an entire video dedicated to this entire boss after all. Rather than explaining it again, you should go watch it. But basically, Cresson is a boss that can only be hit for 5 seconds. The stage contains several powerful enemies, some of them taking 2 objective shields, some of them freezing you, some of them buffing the boss's stats, some of them having a very short path to the blue box. You're constantly bombarded with dangers, and the only way to kill the boss is to turbo buff an operator and one-shot Cresson, otherwise he's gonna fill the map with damaging flowers that increase its own damage and you're gonna lose. In most successful clears, you will find this exact strategy. Buff a Muina or Degenbrecher or other very high damage dealing operator with units like Warfarin, Ak, Shamare, and so on, then burst Cresson fast and deal with the rest of the stage. Sounds easy enough? It's clearly not. On release, Braving Nature 15 Sentinel was widely considered to be the most difficult Arknights stage in the whole game period. It also doesn't help that you have to basically sacrifice an entire floor to get to the 3rd ending while getting some random debuffs like DP generation reduction or the boss having double HP. Thanks for watching this video, guys. This kind of videos takes quite a while to edit, so if you can leave a like and subscribe, I'd greatly appreciate it. Anyway, see you guys in the next video.